Asa Hutchinson, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be with you. I've been looking forward to this.
Well, we have too, Governor, and it was a pleasure having you in Washington at the Reagan Institute during our Reagan Institute Summit Education. Many in Washington and across the country, of course, know you as serving your second term as governor in Arkansas, and then, of course, significant policy positions you've held in previous Republican administrations, and, of course, serving in the U.S. Congress. But for Reaganism and our podcast and show here, you are a celebrity because in 1982, you were appointed by President Reagan as U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Arkansas at the ripe old age of 31. How did that happen?
Well, it's because actually in Arkansas at that time, there were not very many Republican attorneys who had campaigned for Ronald Reagan. And so I was 31, I was pretty aggressive, and there was a short list of people who qualified. So that's the humble approach to it. But it's really, you backtrack just a little bit, that during that campaign, I was the city coordinator for Ronald Reagan. And of course, Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart, was my neighbor. He was in that community with me. And one of the things that I did, I got a full page ad out endorsing Ronald Reagan for president against Jimmy Carter and explained the reasons for it. And Sam and Helen Walton signed onto that and helped pay for it. And
Wow.
So, yeah, it's a pretty good Sam Walton story, because Sam saw the wrong direction of the country. And even though he tried to stay out of politics, it's one of those times that he says, I've got to be there for this. And he put his name behind Ronald Reagan. And whenever the election was over with, I walked out of the courthouse, and one of my Democrat friends looked at me and he says, hey, you might as well put your name in the hat for United States Attorney. And I'm 31, but I pursued that, and I was lucky enough to get that with the recommendation of Congressman John Paul Hammerschmidt.
That is a great story. The Reagan campaign, the Reagan machine must have just been overjoyed, overwhelmed. I heard they have this young, campaign supporter managed to get Sam Walton to back Reagan. That really must have had a ripple effect, huh?
Well, I hope so. It certainly did in our community for sure. But that's the kind of momentum that he had. And it was such an exciting night in 1980 because, first Ronald Reagan won the presidency. And then, of course, the Senate flipped and went Republican. And some of the old lions of the Senate on the Democrat side went down. And then in Arkansas, that's when Frank White beat Bill Clinton. So we really had an election night to celebrate in 1980. And I was right in the courthouse among all my Democrat friends, and I was just all pumped up.
That's great. Yeah. Well, I guess Clinton had a comeback, but yeah, that was a great moment for Republicans in 1980. I'm looking here over your left shoulder for those watching, and there's a picture of Reagan. It's got to be you there. What's transpiring there?
Well, I'll just bring it up here.
There we go.
I don't know. There you go.
You look exactly the same. There we are.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, I have the young people come in, and I show them this picture, and they all recognize Ronald Reagan, but not many of them recognize me because I looked a little bit different back then. But this is at the end of my time as U.S. Attorney, and that's whenever I got to go to the Oval Office, and I got to visit with President Reagan there. And of course, you see in the picture the motto on his desk, "It can be done."
Yes.
And I still tell the stories of that occasion, which are extraordinary. And as we go through this podcast, there'll probably be some references to that meeting and some of how I was able to use the conversations I had with the president then.
Well, look forward to hearing it. And, what we'll do on this is you've had such a rich and storied political and policy career. I'm going to jump into policy issues really as we go through the various positions you've held. Almost use those positions as a launching point for our discussion. In 1996, you became a member of Congress. You're elected to U.S. House of Representatives. actually you succeeded another Hutchinson, your brother, who was previously in that seat and successfully ran for U.S. Senate from Arkansas, which I had forgotten until preparing for this. So give me a little sketch of what the Hutchinson home was like, and was politics just kind of what was for dinner every night? Give me a sense of how two brothers really ascended to such political heights in Arkansas, which of course wasn't really a Republican stronghold, certainly when you and he were going through running for office in Arkansas.
No, in fact, it was a Democratic state all the way through. We had no statewide Republicans elected, no congressional members elected at that time. We had maybe one or two in the General Assembly. So it was strong Democratic state. And whenever I was growing up, my mom and dad were independents. They were not that engaged. I think one of them voted for John Kennedy and one of them voted for Richard Nixon. They split their vote. And I'm the youngest of 6 children. And other than my brother Tim, who got elected to the United States Senate, and myself, the rest of them are normal. They didn't get in politics. So we were a fairly typical household, farming family. And but as I got older, my first recollection of politics was in 1964, was it, with Goldwater running. And my brother and I sat there with the can of Goldwater election night. And of course, prior to that, we heard Ronald Reagan's great speech.
You heard the time for choosing speech. You recalled that from 1964.
I did hear that. I did hear that. And, I'm in, junior high school, but it was inspiring to me. I mean, just to understand the history of the moment. And so, we followed that through. That's just background. It's my political interest. That's how I became interested in politics. Now, I went through school and I became a lawyer, and politics wasn't my design. It was just I was interested in it and I followed it. I understand how important it was. One thing led to another, but I lost races first. I lost a race to the United States Senate. I lost a race for Attorney General before I got elected to the United States Congress. But it was a special time in 1996 when my brother Tim got elected to the United States Senate. I got elected to Congress at the same time. And it's the only time in history that brothers got elected in the same election to the House and Senate. Now, in other occasions, one would get elected to the Senate and 2 years later, one would get elected to the House or vice versa. But ours was simultaneously. It was a little bit dicey, but we won that, and it was a great joy.
I'm curious about that. I mean, obviously, great affinity for your brother. Clearly, you kind of were talking, engaging in politics growing up. Were the political consultants frowning and saying this is a bad idea in '96, or did it seem like it would have the positive effect which resulted?
Well, everybody was nervous about it because we had some opposition from political leaders in Arkansas that said we shouldn't have one family dominate 1/3 of the federal delegation. And so, yeah, it was a little bit of an issue. And in fact, the way we handled it, my brother Tim, when he campaigned, he says, "You're on your own. I'll see you after the election." And we were never on the same platform together.
Never on the stage together.
During the election, we stayed studiously away from each other's campaign. And so it was quite a celebration after the election when we first came together. That was quite a scene.
Yeah, I can imagine. Now, when you look at kind of the coverage of your time serving in the House, what filters to the top is your involvement in the prosecution of the impeachment of President Clinton, which certainly a known figure in the Arkansas delegation, was governor, of course, that is President Clinton in Arkansas. Was that a significant moment for you serving in the House of Representatives? And if so, kind of what was the takeaway kind of as you reflect on it?
Oh, it was a terribly difficult moment for our country. And it was challenging for me because, I'm impeaching a president from my home state. And that is fraught with political turmoil and angst. And so it was a difficult decision. Whenever I was asked to, I was on Judiciary Committee, so I didn't have much choice on the House side. But then Chairman Henry Hyde asked me to be a House manager, which means I'd be a prosecutor on the Senate side. And my initial reaction was, there's no way possible am I ever going to do this. But, I thought about it, I prayed about it, and it really came down to my regard for the Constitution, but also that I believe that my temperament, my approach to things as a professional member of the Congress, looking out after the country, can communicate better why we're doing this, the importance of it, and I just didn't want to leave that to somebody else. So
yeah, well, there are different kinds of members on the Judiciary Committee and different approaches to impeachment. You get the sober kind of fact, lawyerly, law-based kind of participant, and then you have those who are less tied to the facts and the law and more impassioned by the politics. I guess that's where the point you were making.
You said it very well, and I said I'm going to be charged with this in history. I at least want to be able to present my own personal views and approach to it. So yes, I took the lawyerly approach. I was a former federal prosecutor, and so I think I helped our country through a very difficult time in the right way. Looking back on it in history, obviously there's different perspectives, but I'm still pleased with the way I conducted myself, and I think I did help our country through a challenging time.
Well, it's a good point. I mean, so much that we think about these political events, and impeachment is a political action. It's carried out by political actors, but there's the kind of institutional component, and are people approaching it in a way that advances the interests of the institution. Let me ask you one more on impeachment, then we'll go to some of the other positions and roles you've had. Obviously, President Trump was impeached twice by the House of Representatives. Do you think the Congress has gone to impeachment too much? Do you think we're kind of entering a period where impeachment is a tool that perhaps should be used less? Even there are headlines this week that Republicans are thinking about as an opportunity to impeach President Biden over his handling Afghanistan. You're sitting in a state capitol now. We're probably really happy you're removed from the in and outs of Washington. But I was curious if you have a perspective on just impeachment more broadly.
I do. I do think we go to it too quickly, and we go to it in a partisan fashion. And you can look back and say, well, that same breach was true during the Clinton impeachment. And we worked hard, tried to bring some bipartisan efforts there. I was certainly trying to do that. But it's still, even with all of that, because of some of the saber rattling and some of the partisan advocates there, it tainted the proceedings even at that time. And then the Trump proceedings were in the same way. It came down largely to party line votes and division, even though there was some crossover. But I don't think impeachment has paid off for the party that initiates it. Generally, it is done, though, by conviction and general disagreement on matters of principle. So you've got to really look at your heart and look at the Constitution and say, is this worth it for our country and for the party to go through this? Because history tells us it's very, very divisive. In the end, there's a very, very high bar for impeachment of a president.
Let's move to your time serving in the Bush administration. You left the House of Representatives. President George W. Bush was elected, and you take on the role as administrator of the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA. Note that you were confirmed 98-1 in the Senate, which astounds me for a few reasons. One, the Senate doesn't confirm people these days, let alone when there's, someone, the other party, you'll rarely get a 98-1 vote like that. Two, you were, as you just talked about, involved in the Clinton impeachment, right? So you would assume there's some retribution. And then three, the DEA, and we'll talk about this. It has really had riddled, and maybe it's later on, but with difficulty getting people confirmed in the job. I was surprised to learn that we've had an acting administrator of DEA since 2015. Here we are in 2021. So that 98-1 vote in the Senate, that really stands out. Tell me about why you think that happened.
Well, those are good observations. And in reference to the DEA, today it is shameful that we've had acting administrators there. We've had really so many challenges in terms of drug enforcement and the difference of federal policy versus state policy on drug prosecution. So it's a different day and time now than whenever I got confirmed. We were still very aggressive on the fight against illegal drugs and recognize the importance of the DEA, which is incredibly respected internationally. A lot of people don't realize that the DEA has offices in scores and scores of countries across the globe and great partnerships. And it's an integral part of what we do in our international controls over illicit drugs. But the interesting part, though, as you pointed out, is I just come through an impeachment trial on the Judiciary Committee, very partisan, very controversial, at least the perception of it. And the greatest honor I had was that Congressman John Conyers, who is the ranking member on the Judiciary Committee on which I served.
He was from Michigan and longtime member in the House of Representatives and subsequently served as chairman. I mean, he was an old bull on the Democratic side.
Absolutely. He walked over to the Senate with me and stood there with me and introduced me in the confirmation proceedings. And of course, he did that because we had mutual respect, even though we disagreed on a lot of issues. And he was willing to come over and say, this is a guy that can work across the aisle. Here's somebody that you can trust. And he spoke for me. And
I don't know if our listeners, this is kind of an inside the Beltway observation, but the House Judiciary Committee, at least today, is the most partisan, at least publicly partisan in their fights and the way they talk about issues, and so suspicious one side or the other. That it's amazing, Governor, that John Conyers did that. I mean, it just reflects, obviously, the bipartisan work and the approach you took and the principled approach that even your political opponents had to see.
Well, thank you. And the other part of it was the senators who was voting on my confirmation actually had a chance to see me in action and get to know me. I wasn't a blank slate because I just spent 60 days over there trying a case in front of them. So they saw me at work, and the quiet relationships were interesting. Senator Patrick Leahy from Vermont, either during the trial or right afterwards, he sent me some Vermont syrup. He found out I liked it. And so building those relationships actually didn't make it more difficult. It actually made it easier to get confirmed because they knew me.
That's a fantastic set of anecdotes talking about the process of getting confirmed and the bipartisan relationships for something that, of course, there's certainly policy differences, Republicans and Democrats over the Drug Enforcement Administration. Of course, you were very involved in the Congress in terms of highlighting the concerns with methamphetamines, which this is, period before, 2001. Of course, the whole country became seized by it in the years that followed. When you were the administrator, kind of looking back on it now, what would you have done differently, or what would you have focused more on in light of what became this pandemic of methamphetamines?
Well, we did a lot of things right whenever I was there. We recognized that law enforcement has to work with the treatment community, with the education community all together. And so it wasn't just law enforcement over here on an island. In fact, whenever we would go into a community for an enforcement operation, I had a program in which I wanted a commitment from the community after we arrested the cartel or the drug dealers that they would come in with improved resources for addiction treatment, education programs, community engagement, so it just didn't backfill with more drug dealers. So we had the right approach while I was there. You've got to remember that 1 month after I was sworn in as administrator of the DEA, the 9/11 attack occurred. And so I went about my business for 2 years, but there was a different concern in our country. I mean, terrorism overshadowed everything. And what I was able to do as administrator of the DEA was on 9/11, for example, we turned our drug informants and our agents out there trying to gather information on what might be the latest next terrorist attack. And so we really worked closely with the other agencies because if in Afghanistan, after 9/11, we went in there and we set up a containment operation trying to get a handle on the opium operations that were funding the Taliban.
Right.
And so we did a lot of things there, but they were a little bit different than normal simply because it was during the time right after 9/11.
Yeah, well, we're as coming up on the 20th anniversary of those attacks, and of course, you left DEA as administrator to take on a highly significant role, in part for the reason just outlined, when you became undersecretary for the new Department of Homeland Security, focusing on border and transportation security. Tell us about that. What was it like going into a new agency, DHS? Nobody really disputes the importance of their mission, but also at least the agency has a reputation in Washington for just being this kind of vast bureaucracies of agencies that are knitted together that doesn't work as efficiently, as effectively as it should. What was your experience in kind of reflecting on it? How has DHS done in the years since?
Wow. Well, I mean, first, my 2 years at DEA were just supreme. I love that agency. I love the heart of all of the agents that were really trying to do the right thing. And I would love to have stayed there longer, but whenever the president calls and says, we're creating the new Department of Homeland Security, and with my background as a federal prosecutor, as DEA, working border issues, and even in Congress, it was really a perfect fit. And so I went over there and took that responsibility. And you're right, DHS, it was 22 different agencies coming together into one new department. And there were 180,000 employees trying to build this culture of Homeland Security together. Secretary Tom Ridge was one of the best to work with he was my boss. I was under a secretary, but I had 110,000 of those employees and agents that reported to me for border security, which included Border Patrol. It included the old INS, which was Immigration Enforcement, Customs, and then it also included TSA. So I had a very big challenge in front of me. And the
TSA was established during your tenure, because TSA was, I thought, maybe it existed before, but certainly was ramped up in a significant way right after 9/11.
That's true. TSA existed before, but for example, our air marshal program had diminished to probably fewer than 20 air marshals. And obviously we had to beef all of that up in an emergency fashion after 9/11. And TSA, I guess, was created after the 9/11, but Homeland Security was created 2 years after that and came into existence. So it was still very, very fresh. But you look at the challenges. We were new. We were coming in there my first day on the job. And you got to think about, I'm a lawyer, I've been in Congress, I've been an administrator. I come into, they called it the NAC, the Nebraska Avenue Complex, which is an old naval facility. And I go in there, and the first thing that happens is there's a plane that's hijacked from Cuba. And my operations officer comes to me and said, Mr. Secretary, we've got a plane hijacked from Cuba that's headed toward the airspace of the United States. We don't know whether it has evil intent or what. What should we do about this? They're asking me what we should do about this. This is my
very real. I don't remember that. This is kind of after 2003, but a time where any hijacking was, of course, going to get everybody's attention.
Well, it was, you know, that was just the kind of, you had to learn as you went. You had to rely upon the team that was built, but it was incredibly exciting is probably not the right word for it, but it was intense every day just because of the threat of terrorism, the reality of it that was so close to us. You know, we had the red alerts, the orange alerts, the concentration that we had as a country, and the threat information that was coming in. So I was in the middle of that, and for a farm boy from Gravett, going into the Situation Room with the President of the United States, President Bush, looking at these issues was an experience that I'll never forget.
You know, here we are, we're at this 20th anniversary of 9/11, and people have forgotten clearly just how seized Americans were, and elected leaders like yourself and policy officials were by the terrorist threat. This notion that, you know, a ragtag terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda, given a safe haven in Afghanistan, could present a existential threat to the homeland. You know, that was something that all Americans understood. If they couldn't articulate it, they felt after 9/11. Here we are, 20 years later. President Biden decided to pull out all U.S. forces from Afghanistan. There were only a few thousand when he entered office. Yet we know there are terrorist elements in Afghanistan. Hard for the Biden administration to deny it, because we saw one, you know, just recently, which led to the death of 13 U.S. troopers. Do you think, because of the positions you've held and where you were in government at the time, that our elected leaders and policy experts have forgot the basic lessons of 9/11?
Well, I do. And the biggest, I mean, we see a lot of issues as to the way that we pulled out of Afghanistan. And the biggest concern is that we lose our intelligence gathering operation for new terrorist activity. We lose the capacity of Bagram Air Force Base. We lose a lot of our capability in that entire region. And it doesn't take a CIA operative to figure out that we're going to go back to the arena that was pre-9/11, which was where the Taliban controlled the environment. And while they're not necessarily day-to-day friendly with the terrorists, they gave them free operating room for their terrorist training camps. And that's the challenge we're going to see as to whether the Taliban can resist that, or the capability to stop it, where the terrorists become a threat again globally, and even to the United States of America, even though it's so far away. So there's a lot of worries that we're going to go back to where we were pre-9/11. And I want to emphasize that our military men and women for 20 years there made a big difference for our country, because they were there on the offense, kept us safe in the homeland. So every American blood that was shed there protected us, and that can't be diminished, but you still have to worry about the future. And as much as anything, it is the respect that we've lost in that region, and how our enemies and our adversaries and our competitors will take advantage of that or question the strength of the United States.
Well said, Governor. And to me, when you listen to the president explain his decision making and views with respect to Afghanistan, it really does not point to the success of our military and the policymakers that put the plans in place that the military executed, which was it kept the homeland safe. There was another attack on the homeland, and certainly from your experience, both in the Department of Homeland Security, looking at the border issues, overseeing the border, and then as governor, I mean, it is clear that that is a vulnerability we can't take for granted. And as others have pointed out, you really can't wish away. Recently, you had participated in a bipartisan group meeting of governors with President Biden, and the topic of discussion was about Afghan refugees. Tell us, to the extent you can, about that session, what the president was asking, and to the extent that it was something that you had a chance to weigh in on, both in terms of the president's decision or to the specific topic, which was Afghan refugees.
Well, I was actually at the National Governors Association meeting in Denver when we got word that the president wanted to have a conference with a bipartisan group of governors on the Afghan refugee issue. And that was to be set on a particular day. But in the interim, the terrorist attack in Afghanistan occurred, which we lost 13 of our military personnel. And so the president changed his schedule. And so that conversation did not take place. But in talking to my other governors and Republican colleagues, particularly, there is a understanding as to the Afghan refugees that stood alongside of us for 20 years at great risk to themselves. It would almost be against the character of America not to open up our shores to them, our doors for them, and to make sure that they have a place to come in the United States if they have no other place to go. And so I'm proud of my fellow governors for opening up that door, recognizing that need. I made a statement early on that Arkansas should be included in that. And, we took in thousands and thousands of Vietnam refugees into Fort Chaffee after Saigon fell. And we will welcome those in if we're selected to bring any Afghan refugees here as well.
Oh, so do you anticipate Afghan refugees going to Fort Chaffee, or is that something that's not decided yet?
They actually, the Defense Department, the State Department came and looked at that, and it was on the short list, but they wanted facilities that they could bring in a larger volume. So I think it's Fort Lee in Virginia, I think Fort Bliss in Texas are being looked at, or actually are in operational mode to bring in the refugees as that comes about. But then, they'll be processed there and vetted fully, and also, all the public health requirements and those kind of things. But it's going to be a broad effort that many states will be involved. They're not all going to stay in the state that they're brought into initially. They will be spread out across the country. And we don't have any details on that yet. But I expect that just about every state will be affected in some way in regard to the need to provide homes for these refugees.
Just to take a step back on immigration policy, certainly you've outlined with us kind of the moral imperative for supporting our Afghan partners, those who have fought with us, died with us, and of course would support those who are coming in on the special immigrant visa, the SIVs. But as a Republican governor from Arkansas, who has served as Department of Homeland Security lead on border and immigration, who has been a Republican chairman of your state, give me a perspective of how Republicans are looking at immigration, and should look at immigration, because it consistently, is an issue that Republicans criticize, right? And rightfully so, for in my view, illegal immigration, but are also perceived as being anti any immigration. Give me your take on it, both as a governor and elected Republican, and then more broadly, the dynamic within the Republican Party around this issue.
Well, no one feels more firmly than I do about protecting our border. I have right now some National Guard servicemen and women from Arkansas down on the border providing additional support. And so that's an area that we want to have the protections against the illegal flow of immigrants into our country. Now, the mistake that we make as Republicans is that we don't showcase our appreciation of immigrants. So rhetoric is important in the political world. President Reagan understood that. And so every time I talk about we've got to secure the border, I also balance it with saying we are a nation of immigrants, and we want to be a welcoming nation, and we want to have that legal path for people to come here. And just simply that rhetoric is really important to send the signal that we're just not against something, but we actually balance it with understanding the contribution that immigrants have made historically and continue to make in our country. And I think we're growing. I was very proud of the Arkansas General Assembly this year. President Obama created the DACA students and the DACA relief for those that had come in here as young people, and they were not legal citizens. They didn't have a legal presence here, but they were brought in as young people, and they're part of America's fabric. Well, they have a legal presence now, and the General Assembly in Arkansas this last session, which is Republican dominated, passed a law that gave all of the DACA students access to the licenses in Arkansas, which they're previously prohibited from because they weren't legal residents or citizens. But now they can access the professional licensing. They go into nursing, and everybody knows we need more nurses. They can go into the other licensed professions. And so that's a signal, I think, that's good, that we recognize their contribution. We just need to do more of that. In terms of the Afghan refugees, there's a greater commitment, a greater consensus that we have a moral obligation as Americans to stand with them when they've stood with us. It goes, there's all these caveats, and you don't want to get sidetracked with them, but sure, they need to be vetted. We need to be aware that someone could try to sneak in somebody that wants to do us harm. So we've got to do all those proper checks, but you should not use that as an excuse not to let in those that have really, really been with us. And it's part of our obligation and character of our country.
You mentioned that this outreach from President Biden to speak with a bipartisan group of governors came really, I guess, to your desk, virtual desk, because you do serve as chair of the National Governors Association, and you've emphasized, there's a headline saying that Washington needs to hear from us, us being governors. Expand on that. You've had the perch in Washington, as we've discussed, from many different consequential seats, but now you're in your second term as governor of Arkansas. What is it that Washington needs to hear from our governors?
Well, I have to divide that in two buckets. As chairman of the National Governors Association, I have to bring people together, both Democrats and Republican governors, for us to agree upon policy decisions. The one thing we agree upon, and that's what I want to advocate for, is the role of the states. Under the 10th Amendment to our Constitution, if there's not a specially delegated power to the federal government, that is reserved in the states. And it's never been illustrated more importantly than in the last 18 months during the pandemic as to the important role of the states play in terms of public health, in terms of management during a crisis, in terms of partnership. And so that's the voice we want to have together. And we can have that, both Democrats, Republicans, that, hey, let's have a high regard for the states and the role that they play. There are differences of opinion. We worked together. We supported the bipartisan infrastructure bill. People came together, and it had good pay-fors in there, so it wasn't going to add to the deficit. Now we're going to be explosively in different camps in terms of the $3 trillion human infrastructure bill, because as a Republican, that is money that does not need to be spent. We have sufficient resources here in the state, and with the assistance we already have for rental assistance, for childcare assistance, for utility assistance, and really to take $3 trillion more and add to the future debt of our children and grandchildren is just wrong. And so Republican governors will be opposing that. You'll have Democrat governors taking different positions on that. So my job is to find the areas of consensus, but the role of the states is important. We've never seen that more than what we have the last 18 months. Now we've got to rebuild education, and my initiative is computer science education. And that's something that has a great bipartisan flavor to it, but we can promote that as we've done in Arkansas. And I think that's very important for the next year as my tenure as chairman.
Well, we want to hit on a few of those things, but quick follow-up on computer science. When you came in as governor, I think the first bill you signed, or one of the first bills you signed, required every public school in the state to offer one computer science course. Yet here we are, 6 years later, and only a few or a handful of states have required the same. And what got you onto that? And is this going to be a focus of yours as chair of the NGA? I mean, it's given our economy it's a digital economy, it would seem to be common sense requirement. Perhaps that's not common sense in Washington or across a bunch of other states.
Well, absolutely, it's going to be a priority, and we started that in Arkansas in 2015. Wired magazine had a headline that said, "Why is Arkansas leading the coding movement in the United States?" And
had Wired magazine ever profiled Arkansas before that? That seems kind of unusual.
I don't think they've ever paid any attention, but they are now. And so it's really helped us to attract technology companies and startup technology companies here into the state, because we're producing the talent of coders and software and cybersecurity talent for the companies that we need. But nationally, it is really a security issue. I think we've learned, particularly in the last couple of years, that we can't be dependent on software development, on technology with other companies. We've got to be able to produce it here. We've got to create the innovation here. And you start with that talent pool to do that. And that's computer science education. We can't rely upon our friends in India or other places across the globe. We need to do it here. And the challenge is getting it done. And that's what excites me, is to encourage other states, show what's happened here, but also feature some of the good things that are happening in other states that are leading this effort as well.
Obviously, as a conservative Republican, it's always about doing what you can in government to incentivize the private sector. Any examples or cases you point to where you have companies that are looking at your state, looking at this requirement because they need the workforce with that training and focus?
Yes, we partner with the great companies here for mentorship programs, apprenticeships, but we also have an accelerator program that we're putting state dollars into, but we're leveraging it with private dollars. So those are relying upon the private sector to get it done, but we have FinTech Accelerator, where financial services brings software talent, startup companies from across the nation and globe here to be mentored, to help grow that company. We do that in the healthcare industry as well, and we're looking at the ag. And so those are partnerships with the private sector for startup innovation companies. And that's how you stay fresh. That's how you also bring the entrepreneurs here. It's not just about one skill, but it's about that innovative spirit that technology education brings. And we've got to provide that. We've got some great companies here, from Tyson's to JB Hunt to Bryceland Foods and the food processing industry. They're all technology companies, and we want to provide that talent to them.
All right, watch out Silicon Valley, see what's happening in Arkansas. The other thing that you referenced, talking about the past 18 months and the pandemic and COVID, there have been a lot of, obviously it's hitting everybody, local level. Of course, the national politics has been seized by it. Arkansas school remained open pretty much during the 2020-2021 school year. What did you learn about that? Obviously, in retrospect, I'm assuming it's been applauded and supported. Those states that didn't have their schools open, just you had this gap that emerged between those who were in school and who were not. What's your take on that, looking at it a year and a half out?
Well, it was probably one of the most controversial things that I did a year ago, which was to say we're going to have in-classroom instruction. And there was a lot of pressure from unions, teachers' unions, as well as others, that we can't do that. A year later, the educators, everyone looks back on that and says, my goodness, these kids have to be in the classroom. They have to have that teacher contact. They have to have the social atmosphere of the school. And so that was something we learned. And so this year it's not controversial.
Right.
Everybody knows we have to be there. Then the question is, well, how do we keep them safe? What's the best protection we can have? How do we get our vaccines out there to a greater extent? But they also, and this is just a little bit me, but I think it's absolutely real, the importance of sports and band and cheerleading. These students, they need those opportunities. They need to know the lessons of being a part of a team, and the depression that comes from isolation, the gap that comes with building your own character. That's something that's hard to replace. And so that reinforced the importance of the decision we made to have school last year.
Well, that was certainly a decision that, in retrospect, got a lot of support, and people see the wisdom. Now, here we are today. Arkansas is struggling with the pandemic. Only 40%, last I read, of those eligible for vaccination in Arkansas are vaccinated. And then you signed into law a mask ban, which subsequently you said you regretted or preferred not to have done. How would you play that differently? Obviously, you make the calls at the time they're before you, but it continues to be something that the country is seized by. Those states that are have a mask mandate in place, and those where elected leaders are not allowing for it.
Well, whenever our General Assembly was in session, it was April, that time frame. And at that point, our cases were at an all-time low. Everyone thought the pandemic was, ending. And so it came across my desk a law that banned mask mandates in the schools or in the public venues. I signed that. And, as a leader, I think it's important when circumstances change, you acknowledge it and you say, we need to correct that. And the Delta variant came on. It came on hard here in Arkansas. Our cases went up, our hospitalizations went up. We wanted to have school. And so, yes, I said, I wish I hadn't signed that bill because I didn't know what was ahead. And so I called the General Assembly back into session and say, we need to amend that law. They didn't do it. So subsequently, the court struck it down as unconstitutional. And so now we have the local option in our schools for, whether they choose to require masks or not. I was advocating a simple amendment that would, for those that are 11 and under that could not be vaccinated, they needed to have some protection. Many of the schools now have made it broader than that. But to me, that is a fundamental Ronald Reagan principle, a conservative principle to say, we've got to leave some of these choices to the government that's closest to the people. How can you argue with a school board that says we want to protect our children and we're going to require a mask in the school to make sure they have the best protection?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is certainly the conservative outlook. It's leave it to the local leadership that are closest to the people, particularly on issues like this. You can have a part of the state where the vaccination rate's high and everybody's doing well, and you can go to a different part of the state, the country, and it's not doing well. What has to happen to increase the vaccination rate in Arkansas, Governor?
Well, first of all, we've done a lot, and the fear factor increases vaccination rates, the risk. And so as we saw the Delta variant come on hard, our vaccinations rate went up. As well, I went out in town hall meetings. I did it the old-fashioned way, and I've been to 16 different cities having town hall meetings, encouraging vaccinations, bringing the community together where they have a local doctor, being able to talk about it to people that trust that local doctor. And so that's been very successful. It's helped us in vaccinations as well. So we're gradually increasing and very pleased with that. We need to accelerate it even more, but working hard to build that trust in the community. And I assure you, it's not the government going in saying you need to do this. It's about the trusted medical community, true information that is persuasive to people.
Well, wish you success in doing that. It's, correlation's pretty clear that those who are hospitalized almost exclusively are those who are not vaccinated, right? So it seems to be that if you have a trusted person communicate that, it should be effective. We only have a couple minutes left, Governor. Thank you so much for your time, but we can't let you go before we do the lightning round where we ask our guests to share with us their favorite Reagan quote, Reagan speech, and book about President Reagan. We'd love to hear all three, but whatever you got, share with us, Governor.
Well, of course, I love Peggy Noonan's book, When Character is King. I love the stories that relates about the human side of Ronald Reagan. I love, in terms of speeches, it's got to be the 1992 speech that President Reagan made at the Republican National Convention. It was his last public address, and it's special to me because my 16-year-old son was paging at that convention, and I stood beside him as he stood there and was inspired by President Reagan. And so President Reagan's inspired me and the second generation as well. And those are special.
That's the amazing thing about President Reagan. By that time, he was an elderly man. I mean, he was old when he left office, yet he continued to enjoy the support of young people.
Absolutely, and inspired them. And of course, I loved reading the history books after the fact, where his handlers and advisors were worried about President Reagan being able to give that speech effectively in 1992. And of course, he hit it out of the park. And so for that reason, it's probably one of my favorite. In terms of quotes, there's so many quotes. I love, whenever the Challenger went down tragically, and when he talked about the finger of God reaching up and touching that, and the inspirational words. I love the quotes when he says, if someone agrees with me 80% of the time, they're my friend, not my enemy. And I think that's a good lesson for today.
Yeah. Well, we'll leave it there, Governor. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to having you back on.
Thank you. It's been great. Thank you.